Hello, I'm Mark, and welcome to part 2 of my Unreal Engine tutorial on how to build a data-driven time simulation component for your Unreal Engine games. So first off, let's start with a quick little recap of what we did in part 1. In part 1, we went ahead and defined all of our structures that we're going to need to drive our simulation component. So first off, we defined our core time config. As you can see, we just got some data here on how we define hours, weeks, and years. And then after that, we created a little time structure which will house our raw seconds, as well as some implementation on how we want to interact with our seconds. Then we also created finally our table, which will be housing all of our clock information and how we want to manage that. And so again, we added some implementation functions there, just keeping the logic close to where the data source is. All right, and then finally, because we're dealing with time, there's a bunch of calculations we need to make. So what we did was we created a little struct that we could then use to handle all of the equations for us. So that covers everything in part 1. So let's move on to part 2. So once again, we will be basing this time little simulation component off the Epoch and Unix timestamp. And so if anyone's interested in how that works, I left a link in the description below to this website, which can kind of show you how the system works and how it's calculated, so that you can then calculate, as you can see, it's updating the time stamp, and then you can then take that timestamp and convert it how you want it output. So we're just going to go and bring that back over here. All right, so let's get started. So let's go ahead and build a component. So to do that, let's come over to our Unreal Engine editor. We're going to come up into the content drawer, come down to C++ classes, come into the project folder. And as you can see right now, we don't have a reference to structures. So Unreal Engine, it will reference classes, but it won't reference any structures you've created, but they are there. So what we're going to do to add our class that's going to be simulating time for us, we're just going to go and right click, go to new classes, and then what I'm going to do is we're going to come to all classes, and then we're going to come to object. So since this is going to be residing in the game instance, we just need to make this just a regular little object. So I'm just going to click on object, go to next. I'm going to make sure we have the public private folder, and then we just need to give it a name. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it core chronometer. That's just what I'm going to call my component. And then I'm just going to hit create class. And then we'll just let the Unreal Engine go ahead and do its thing and create our class for us. Come on, there it is. Compiling, and we have a good compile, so let's go ahead and move over, and let's just go ahead and reload all. Alright, so what we now have is we just have a empty object, standard regular plain Unreal Engine object, and this is where we're going to be building our component. So first off, let's go ahead and add the header file to all of our structures that we're going to need for this component. So I'm just going to do that, and that matches that. We're good. Save real quick. All right, next, for outputting purposes, I'm going to bring in an enumerator. This will act as kind of a selector for me, since we'll be managing multiple. We have the ability to manage multiple clocks through this component. So I'm just going to bring that in. So this is just enum blueprint type, so it can be read in the blueprints, and then give it a unique name, and then just give it a unique enum, and then this is just for outputting purposes. So I'm just calling it UTC. You could call it default. This is local time, and then time at index. So that's that. Okay, next we need to add a little bit of formatting to our little uClass tag up here so it can be seen within the editor. So first we're going to make it blueprintable. I'm going to default it to the instance, and then make it edit in line new. All right, now that we've got that done, let's just go ahead and just set this up. So I'm going to add the Add public section, add a protected section, and another public section. Unreal Engine tends to kind of structure it out this way, so I'm just going to follow their structure. Alright, so under public, let's go ahead and just add a default constructor. We're not going to do too much with this constructor in this video, so we'll just leave that there. And then under protected, and we'll just leave that green squiggly there for now. And then under protected, let's go ahead and add our properties. So I'm just going to copy them all over. And so these are all of the exposed properties. So we've got our handy little debug on-off property right here. I'm going to add a property so that we can set the default clock that we want to start with. And then our time speed. So this is how we're going to be able to control the speed of the clock as we simulate time. And then our pointer to our data table. So since everything's going to be pulling off a table, that's where we're going to have that. And then finally, this is just a little time lock. So what we want to do is when time is running, we want to make sure that nothing can change it that's not supposed to be able to change it. So this is just a little locking variable that I've added. All right, after that, let's go to our other variables. So I'm just going to bring those in real quick. So first off, we've got our core time. This is where our raw seconds are going to be housed. And it's a struct so that it's just easy to move it in and out of a save and loading system. Then I've got a pointer, a row pointer to our default time. I've got a row pointer to a local clock if we want to have that, we want to have our standard clock as well as where we are, in relationship to our standard clock. And then we've also got the ability to have an array in case you, again, this is more for outputting purposes. If you want to show all the clocks in a game, you could do that there. Again, just a little feature. And then I'm just going to bring in two functions. So first off, we've got our error message function, which is just standard. And then we've got another function that will allow us to go ahead and pull back a clock at a given index. And that's really kind of working with our time zone list here. All right, so I'm just going to hit save. Okay, so under the public section, I'm just going to go ahead and add so the first one is going to be our void init, and this is just our initializer function that will be executed outside of the class. So this will be done from within the game instance. Next, I'm going to add the set time configurations. So this is just a way for us to go set up the defaults in the local for us. We have a function here that is used to update our raw seconds, and that's going to take in a delta time. I'm just going to add these two together since they're inlined. So what we've got is our pause timekeeping. So this is a function to allow us to update that flag, and then this is just a function to get the structure. And so this will be used more in saving and loading. And so we have a getter, so again we also have a setter, so there it is. So again, if we're pulling from a save file because we want to reload it, this is where we'd pull it in. All right, so I'm going to include both of these functions as well. So one of the big uses of being able to simulate time is to then create these time tokens. Which can be used, so if you wanted to drive events that are time-based events in other parts of your code, right, you'd probably you'd want to generate a token based on number of hours in the future, and that's what this function will do. It'll generate a time token in the future, and then as you're kind of ticking through in whatever component you're using, you can go check to see if that time token is still valid, And if it's valid, then you're not going to do anything. But on the other hand, once this time token expires, then you may want to trigger an event in another piece of your code to do something like, say, spawn in something on a given day or in a given hour, or respawn if you go and kill something and you wanted to then come back to life. You could do that there. So that's what those tokens are for. We probably won't do anything in this demo with them, but they're there for you to be able to use. And then finally, I'm just going to bring them all in at once, since they all do mostly the same thing. We've got our simulate days. This is purely for outputting into the UI. And so we got the get simulate days, get simulate hours, get simulate minutes, get the clock's name, and then get the clock configuration. So this is where all of our configuration data is, so we can also have access to that if we need to do additional formatting in the UI. All right, so now that we've defined our simulation component, let's go ahead and add the implementation. So first off, let's go ahead and fix this. So this is the default constructor, and for this component, I'm not going to do anything here, so I'm just going to go ahead and minimize that. So let's keep that empty. So next up is going to be our error message, our standard error messaging system. So I'm just going to go ahead and just copy that and just paste it in. But again, it's just, if this is turned on in the blueprint, then it'll allow us to output any error messaging by message, color, and second, how long we want it to display in the UI. You could certainly change this to the Unreal Engine log if you just want to output it to a log file and not go to the UI. Or you could put an else there and say if it's turned on, output to the UI. Otherwise, if it's turned off, send it to logging. It's up to you. I'm just going to keep it like this. Okie doke. So let's go to get time at index. So here we are, get time at index. So this is pretty much how we want to, if we wanted to just get one of those clocks from our data table based on an index coming in. So again, the way this is going to work is we're going to first check to see if this array has been loaded. So if it's 0, it means it's an empty array. So first off, we're going to check to make sure our table is valid. If our table is valid, then what we're going to do is we're going to call this, let me just go and color code it real quick. We're just going to call the get all rows off this time config using the pointer symbol. And then we'll just pass the array in. And then what this will do is it will then call this function, and then this will just fill up this array for us. And then once the array is filled, we'll then go ahead and check to see if our index is a valid index for what's in the array. Now, if we already have this, so if number is greater, right, then we don't need to do this again. So this is this will only get fired on the first time this function's called. After that, this will, we'll assume that we have information in here if this number is greater than 0. So then all we do is just execute this over and over. And then if any of this fails, we're just going to return a null pointer back. All right, so moving on, let's go into the public methods or functions. And first off, we'll start off with the init. So go to init. So init, all we're going to do on initialization when this is called is set the time configuration, and we're just going to pass in a blank name. Next is going to be the set time configuration. So I'm just going to go pull this up, fix that. So this is a big one, since this does all the setup for us. So again, let's just color code that. I'm just going to go and minimize this to get some real estate. All right, so here, again, table, make sure that the table is valid. Otherwise, if it's not, the game will crash. Then what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if this has already been created. If this has already been created, then we're golden. Otherwise, if it's null, then we'll go ahead and create it going into the table. And then we're going to do a find row because as part of the component, we will want to define our default clock. If it finds it, then we're good. If it doesn't find it and it's still null, i.e. this string is not in the table, then we'll output an error message. Then we'll do the same thing for local time, to grab that local time clock if we want to use it. And all that is it's just this, if this is not none, so if we pass in a none, that means we just don't want to do this. Otherwise, if it's coming back and there's a string there, then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do the same thing that we did up here. The only difference is we're going to be putting it into the default local time, which is just a separate variable. And then we'll pull the null and then check to see if it's valid. If it's not valid, then we output. And then if it is, we're good. And that should be that. All right, next up is the update chronometer. So this is us updating our simulated time. So I'm just going to pull that code over real quick. All right, so for here, again, we're taking in delta seconds. We're going to be checking to see is the time paused. So again, this is our lock. So if we are in a paused mode, then we do not want to be moving time forward. If we are not in a time pause mode, i.e. this is set to false, we have a little not symbol here to say take the opposite. So here we're not, we're locked, but we can accept the delta seconds. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the delta time, multiply it by the speed, and then that will give us our adjusted, and then we're just going to be putting the adjusted into the update seconds. Pretty simple. All right, so next is the setter. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull that in. And on the setter, I didn't inline this because I wanted to add an extra check. So again, we have our locks. So if we're running, right, and we're updating our seconds, then this function, if anything tries to call this function while we're incrementing time, we don't want it to actually change the clock. So that's what this is there for. It's just, again, it's just a time lock. All right, next, I'm going to go ahead and fix these both together since they kind of work in tandem. So first off, let's go ahead and do the generate. So the generate, all we're doing is we're saying, I want a time token based on X number of hours. And again, this is a double, so you can put a fraction of an hour in if you want, but we're going to calculate by hours. And then what we do here is we're going to say, go to the, here's our handy little utility. We're calling this function, and this is a static function, so we're using the double semicolons, putting the hours in, and then that will translate it to number of seconds for those number of hours, and then we just add them both together and return it, and then that's our stamp. That's our time token stamp. And then on the validate, all we're doing here on the validate is taking that time token back in, just clear that up, and then just checking to see if this time token is greater than the current number of seconds that we're tracking. And if it is, then the token is still valid. Otherwise, if it's not, then the token is no longer valid. And if a token, and this is where you then have your if logic, right, to determine whether you're going to do something or not. Alrighty, so I'm just going to go and minimize all this, get some real estate back. Alright, so next we've got our outputting. So I'm just going to go ahead and fix these first before we bring in the implementation. So since they pretty much follow a similar pattern. And we'll do this one as well. So again, this is just purely for UI now, so I'm just going to minimize those. So we're going to start with the days. I'm just going to go grab our function or the implementation. So I'm just going to go over this one. The others are just the same, just pulling from a different source. That's all. So here we are. This is days. So again, this is where our enumerator comes in handy. So, and I'm also going to make a small little change. So instead of index, I'm going to put index equals 0 here and here and here and here and here. And so what I'm doing here is, so what we're doing is that if this is supplied, right, we can use it. Otherwise, its default is 0. And so there will always be a default coming through of 0. Otherwise, the user can then define it. So it's just a default. So here we're checking the time source. Then we'll check to make sure that we actually have a clock. So this is not null. And then if it's not null, we'll say get total days. And that's where the function is. And we define this in part 1. And then we just pass in our clock by reference. And then it's the same for local. We're just looking at the local row that we've pulled back. And then a little bit different on the index. First, we're going to go and say, let's go and see if there's a clock at that index. We'll do a check. So, and I put is not null. It's the same thing as just putting that there. It's just a different way of writing it out. And then if this is valid, if the clock is not null, then we can go ahead and run this. Technically, yeah, we can run this again. And it's just the UTC. So, and then all this is we're just going to run the same thing over and over again. So for hours, so that was days, simulated hours. So for hours, the only difference real here is we're just going to be using the get hours, and get hours. Close that, and then this is minutes. Same idea. Minutes, minutes, and minutes, and we're good. For name, we're just going to run this. So again, time source. Let's color code it. So name, name, and name. And then lastly, configuration. So I'm just going to pass that in. So, and then again, it works the same way. The only difference is we're just pulling back a different variable on whichever of these rows we're pulling back from. And that should do it for our time components. So I'm just going to save, and let's go ahead and make sure that this thing compiles. All right, we passed the compile test. All right, so let's go ahead and integrate this into a custom game instance. So to do that, we're just going to come back to the editor. I'm going to come to C++ classes, go down to our folder. Now we have a public folder because we have our first class defined. I'm just going to go ahead and add the game instance here. So I'm just going to right click, go to new class. And so this is a game instance. So I'm going to go to all classes, and I'm just say game instance. So there's our game instance. We're just going to hit next, and let's go ahead and give this a name. I'm just going to call my game instance demo game instance. It's in the public folder. Just do that, make sure we're good. So public, everything looks good. Demo game instance. Let's go ahead and say create. Compiling, should be a good compile. Yep. All right, so let's go ahead and pull this up and see what's created for us. All right, so when coming off a game instance, again, it's off this game instance, very similar to what we did with the object. So first off, let's go ahead and add our include, and we want to make sure that all of our includes stay above the generated.h. This should always be the last include in your stack. All right, we don't need to do anything on class because we're actually inheriting from this guy. So we're okay there. Keep the generated. Let's go ahead and just set this up. Public. Protected. And one more public. All right, so under public, we're going to need a constructor, and we will be using this one. Okie doke. Under protected, just the usual fare. The two variables I'm going to be adding, again, debugging on and off if I need to have debugging within the game instance. And then I've also got our reference to our simulated clock system. So there it is. There's the chronometer set to a null pointer, and we've got our categories here. So just systems for debugging, I just put that under there, and then under system I've got simulated time. All right, so next let's go ahead and add some protected functions. So I've got this all systems attached, and again our standard error message for debugging. And then under public, I'm just going to bring them all in. So under public, we've got two functions that we're going to be inheriting from the game instance. One is going to be the init, and we're going to override this. So this is the initialization function that gets called. And then we also have shutdown. Probably won't do anything with shutdown, but we will be doing we will be using the init. And then we have the instance tick. So since this is a game instance, it doesn't actually have a tick component to it. So we're just going to go ahead and piggyback our tick off something else, another objects loop. And so I'm just going to piggyback this off the map. I think that's probably the best place for it. So when the map starts ticking, we'll start ticking here. Okie doke. So let's go ahead and do the implementation. So let's start off with the game instance. I'm going to go ahead and fix that real quick. So here, I'm just going to go bring this over. So under game instance, we've got, I'm just going to go ahead and create a default object. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to run the create default sub object of type chronometer. That's our simulation component. And it's going to just go ahead and set that up for us on initialization. So there it is. Then all systems attached. I'm just going to go open up this. So here, this is just a nice little utility function I like to add, especially when I'm adding subcomponents in the game instance. And so what this does is it'll check to make sure that this has been created correctly for us. So if this is still null for any reason, we'll return false, and usually I'll have some code to say don't do anything. And if I have multiple components, then I would just go ahead and just add, all the way down in the row. So pretty much it says that everything's got to check out before we actually do anything. So that's what that does. Next, again, error message. So I'm going to do that, potential fix. And we're going to just add this real quick. So again, checking to see if the flag's on. If the flag's on, we'll go ahead and output any error messaging if we need to. Okay, init, I'm just going to say show potential fix. And while I'm there, I'm just going to go ahead and fix the shutdown. So because we're inheriting these functions, I'm going to run super init, and here I'm just going to run super shutdown. So if there was anything that you needed to do, in addition to the game shutting down, when the game starts shutting down, you can run your cleanup here, and make sure you put it up here in front of the shutdown. And then for game instance, this is the game starting up. So this is where you'd put any code where you want to when the game's starting up. So for here, we're just going to go ahead and initialize our components that we've added. So here I'm going to do an all systems check. If this checks out, I'm just going to go minimize you, and minimize you, and we'll keep you open. So if all systems check out, then we'll go ahead and run the simulated clocks initializer. And then in shutdown, we're not going to do anything with shutdown right now, so we'll just leave that there. And then the last thing we've got is instance tick, and this is our ability to actually tick time forward. So I'm just going to grab this. And again, I'm just going to do an all systems check, make sure everything's good. If this fails at any point, we're just going to return. We won't even run the tick. And then here, I'm going to do a get world, make sure our world is valid. It should be, but in case it isn't, so we're going to do a quick pointer check, and then after we've done the pointer check, we're going to run the is paused. So if the game is paused, physically paused, then we're not going to run. We don't want to increment down to time. We only ever want to do this when the game is not paused. Again, we're trying to simulate world time in the game, so we don't want it to be ticking if the game if technically time is paused. So that should take care of that. And again, we're using the little not symbol here to make sure that we get the opposite for this to run. All right, so now that we've created our custom game instance, let's go ahead and set this instance up in the in our project. So I'm going to flip back to the editor. And let's go ahead and compile. All right, we have a good compile. So let's come up to the content drawer. So for game instances, which is kind of like at the top of the game, I'm just going to put it right here. So I'm just going to create a blueprint. Here, we're going to come down, we're going to find game instance. And there it is. That's our game instance that we created off the game instance. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. Call it BP my game instance. And I'm going to hit save. All right, I'm just going to open it up. All right, so if you open up the game instance, and let's just expand on this. Right, so it's just a standard blueprint. There's really not much in here. Our information is actually over here on the right side. So here we have system, and then under here we have simulated clock. So the constructor, we added the clock already, so we don't have to worry about setting that up there. And then here, this is our systems information. So there's our default time. And that maps to the table that we created. Actually, I'll just pull the content drawer here. So here's our table that we created in part 1. So there's default time here. So there's our default clock. So that will be that's what we're setting as our default. That's how fast we want to go. I'm just going to set this up to 400 so we can go a bit faster. And then time configuration. There's our data table. And now we're all set. We've just configured that. So let's go ahead and tie this blueprint into the game, into the actual game itself. To do that, we just need to come up to Edit, come to Project Settings, move this over, and all we need to do is come to Maps and Modes, and then come all the way down to here, which is Game Instance. Find your game instance, and now you're set to use your custom game instance. So we can close that, and the game is now set to use that. Okay, so I think that's going to do it for part 2 of the video series. In part 3, we'll go ahead and build out our widgets. So we should all be in the editor, and we'll be doing this all through blueprints in part 3. And we'll create our UI, and we'll get the times ticking, pull in the right clocks, and make sure everything works, and then add the saving and loading so that we can save it and then reload it. That will all be done in part 3. So once again, if you like what I'm doing, feel free to like and share my videos, as well as subscribe to my channel, and I will see you again in my next video. Cheers. Bye.